Grid capacity warnings are reshaping facilities' site selection. Why utility capacity warnings are forcing a rethink of site selection and expansion planning. Utility grid capacity warnings are changing how facilities leaders must approach site selection. For years, power availability was a confirmatory step in the site selection process. Facilities leaders verified that utility service existed, estimated the cost, and moved on. That sequence is now producing expensive mistakes in a growing number of markets. For most of the past decade, the standard playbook for facility expansion looked roughly the same. Find the site, secure the permits, line up the capital, and assume the power would follow. Utilities were a service provider. Power was a utility. You paid for it, it showed up. That sequence is broken in a growing number of markets. And the clearest evidence isn't in a regulatory filing or a policy paper. It's in what utilities themselves are putting on the record. Over the past 18 months, regional grid operators and utilities across the country have issued formal capacity warnings, notices that certain service territories or substations cannot reliably support additional large loads within normal project timelines. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation's NERC most recent long-term reliability assessment flagged elevated risk conditions in regions covering more than a third of U.S. commercial and industrial electricity demand. These aren't theoretical projections. They're operational realities playing out in interconnection queues, substation upgrade timelines, and service agreement negotiations right now. Why grid capacity problems for facilities leaders were years in the making. What's changed in 2026 isn't that the grid ran out of capacity overnight. It's that the cumulative weight of deferred infrastructure investment, surging electrification demand, and data center load growth has finally closed the gap between theoretical availability and real-world execution. For facilities teams, that means a dynamic they could once treat as someone else's problem. A utility issue, a transmission issue, a policy issue, is now landing in their capital planning cycles. The numbers illustrate why. According to the Department of Energy's DOE grid deployment data, transformer lead times that once ran 12 to 16 weeks now routinely stretch past 2 years for large units. Distribution-level upgrades, which are often the actual bottleneck for new commercial and industrial connections, operate on funding and permitting cycles that can add 18 to 36 months to a project's energization timeline. A facility approved to break ground in 2026 may not receive full electrical service until 2028, if the substation serving the site is already operating near capacity. That mismatch is not a rounding error. It is a structural misalignment between how fast companies want to move and how fast grid infrastructure can respond. How utility capacity constraints should change your site selection checklist. Facilities and energy leaders who are still treating site selection as a real estate exercise with an electrical component are making a category error. Power availability, not zoning, not logistics, not labor, is emerging as the upstream constraint that determines whether an expansion project can execute on schedule and within budget. This requires some concrete changes to how pre-site diligence gets done. It's no longer enough to confirm that utility service exists in a given geography. The questions that matter now are more specific. What is the available capacity at the nearest substation? What is the utility's timeline for adding capacity if current levels are insufficient? What is the interconnection queue position for the service territory? Has the utility issued any formal capacity warnings for this area in the past 24 months? These aren't engineering questions. They're business questions. And increasingly, they're the questions that determine whether a site that looks viable on paper can actually be built and operated on the timeline the business needs. Which U.S. regions face the most severe grid capacity constraints for new facilities in 2026? Not every market faces equal pressure. Grid constraints are geographically uneven, and that unevenness is becoming a factor in competitive site selection. Regions experiencing the highest data center build-out activity, Northern Virginia, Phoenix, Dallas-Fort Worth, parts of the Pacific Northwest, are also the regions where available utility capacity for industrial and commercial users is under the most strain. The load growth that data centers represent is not evenly distributed, and it is concentrating pressure in specific transmission corridors and distribution systems. For facilities leaders making siting decisions over the next 12 to 24 months, the practical implication is this. The lowest cost site on paper may not be the lowest cost site in execution if grid access requires a multi-year upgrade cycle. A location that carries a small premium but has available substation capacity today may save 18 months of schedule and significant carrying costs. That trade-off isn't showing up in most site selection models, and it should be. How facilities leaders can make the case for grid access as a capital planning priority. The friction for facilities leaders is often internal. Site selection models built over years don't naturally accommodate a new variable like grid access timing. Finance teams used to evaluating sites on real estate cost, tax structure, and logistics alignment may not immediately understand why a utility capacity warning changes the financial calculus. And executives under pressure to execute may resist slowing a decision down to investigate a power availability question that the utility should be able to solve. The role facilities and energy leaders need to play right now is translator, not to stop projects, but to ensure the organization understands what it's actually buying when it picks a site and what it's committing to if grid access isn't secured before capital is deployed. The utilities sending capacity warnings aren't doing it to slow business down. They're doing it because the infrastructure genuinely can't absorb unplanned load without compromising reliability for existing customers. That's a physical constraint, not a negotiating posture. And the companies that internalize that reality earliest will be the ones whose expansion projects actually close on schedule. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.